Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? I have the fortune or the misfortune of being one of the anchors for your conference, which I understand has been pretty extraordinary in terms of the dialogue and discussion. I thank you for welcoming me here and asking me to come and speak at First Nations Leading the Way conference and your theme, paddling through the current of change. I certainly want to acknowledge, as I know has been done many times, the ancestral lands of the nations that we are on and the fact that we are on Treaty 6 territory. It's great to be here with you with so many representatives from nations who are actively rebuilding, and the fiscal institutions and the Lands Advisory Board that support you. For all that you do and who you are, I am incredibly proud to be among you and applaud you for the work that you do. And for me, self-government certainly is the foundation for addressing the legacy of colonization. I do not believe there is any way around it. It is only through self-government that First Nations can rebuild on their own terms by exercising jurisdiction and making our own laws in ways that allow us to set and achieve our economic priorities and care for our social, cultural, and physical well-being of our citizens. And to all the nations who have set out on this path, with the support of the First Nations institutions, I applaud you. Making change, as has been said by the young people and to the young people, making change takes courage and leadership, and you are showing that courage and leadership. So now I want to say, and maybe some of you know this, there's a lot of familiar faces in the room. I have been involved with the institutions for many years and in many different roles and different ways. As a chair, as a board member, as regional chief for British Columbia, as a councillor in my home community, and as a minister, yes, of the federal government. And I can say with certainty, the work that these institutions do is, in my view, fundamental to the rebuilding of our nations and governments. It provides foundational infrastructure, the foundational infrastructure needed in our communities to economically thrive and govern well in our ways. And for that reason, I've always been and will always be a champion for what these organizations do. So thank you again. Now, it's been some time since I've spoken to this gathering, and I was talking to Harold. I spoke to First Nations Leading the Way in 2017, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the first gathering, and it was in Musqueam, and at the time I was the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. And so I looked back on my remarks that I spoke that day, and one of the main messages that I gave was about how committed the Prime Minister Trudeau, was to getting the government's house in order and establishing a comprehensive recognition and implementation of rights framework. Well, I think we know how that has gone. I also spoke to the Lands Advisory Board Conference on Enforcement of Laws, and that was more recent in 2023. And in that speech, I spoke a little bit more about some of the themes that you are exploring or have been exploring over the last number of days, about the relationship between economic reconciliation and self-government. So today, I will share with you some of my current observations and thoughts about the path to self-government and reconciliation, and the role you can play and are playing on this path, and how this is important to achieve aspects, certainly, of economic reconciliation. Some of these thoughts you may have heard before, others might be new, as my own perspectives continue to evolve, both because of the roles that I have been fortunate enough to play, as well as the opportunities that I have had in recent years to speak to large groups of people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous across the country, including as part of my recent tour promoting Reconciling History, a Story of Canada. But I'm grateful for the introduction, but perhaps before I start in on that, I can introduce myself just a little bit more. So yes, my name is Jody Wilson Raybould. My ancestral name is Puglas, which means a woman born to noble people. I come from the Muskama, Zawadanuk, and Likwitha people of northern Vancouver Island, just off the coast of British Columbia. We are part of the Kwakwaka'wakw, also known as the Kwakwala-speaking people. My home community is called Wai Kai. My father, his name is Himas Klalilikla. My mother is Sandy Wilson, and my grandmother, Ethel Pearson, her name was Pugladi. So my people, like many people, Indigenous people, are a matrilineal society, where descent is traced and property is inherited through the female line, and where women carry high-rank roles and knowledge. We have hereditary chiefs, always men, who are groomed from the time that they are born, but they are groomed by women. My father is the hereditary chief of our clan, the Eagle clan, and his name, Himas Klalilikla, means number one amongst the eagles, the chief that is always there to help. Now, he was given his name, as I was and my sister, in a potlatch held in a big house, which is our traditional form of government, one that we still practice today. It is here where names are passed down and given from generation to generation. It is here where our laws are made, disputes settled, where people are married, and where wealth is redistributed. It is where the work of our people is done as a collective. Like my peoples, all of our nations had and have our own legal orders and traditional systems of governance. Now, in terms of the history of Canada and before, for our nations, colonialism used law as a weapon against our people, to take away our rights and deny our freedoms, to define us as Indians and place us on reserves, take our children away, take our lands away, and take our culture, society, and identity away, to deny our right to self-determination, including self-government. Thankfully, due to the activism of many generations that have preceded us, paddling the currents of change, and the sacrifice and suffering of so many, the worst has not occurred. We are still here. And now we are in a period of fundamental transitioning, a reckoning, a resurgence, a critical part of which is the rebuilding of our nations and moving away from a period of denial to the recognition of rights. Work that all of you are doing and leading, visibly showing us the way in a new, healthier, more prosperous, and better governed future. So I thought that I would share with you 3 observations about this moment in time of change that I think are particularly relevant to the work that you are doing to rebuild your nations, including the relationship between economic reconciliation and self-government, and how I expect that these changes will continue into the future. So my first observation is that where nations choose to lead in rebuilding their nations, including implementing their own laws and jurisdictions, and in doing so, advancing economic reconciliation, the Crown will increasingly be unable to resist following the leadership you show. Look, you are all leaders, and I know that you all know how to lead the way. That sitting around waiting for the Crown to help lead the way, I believe, is a fool's errand. And that we have the tools now, and we can continue to create more tools. And here's the thing. The fact that the Crown still often appears slow and intransigent does not mean that we are going to be in the same place or position that we have been in the past. Even where the Crown has not taken action or not taken sufficient action because of the actions you all have taken, you have shifted the position of the Crown. They are less capable of resisting, less able to stop progress, and more likely to get out of the way or follow along. It is kind of like, and I'm going to use another metaphor or an analogy, I'm not sure what it is, but it's kind of like going down a path on which there is a huge boulder. The boulder may be too big and heavy to push out of the way. But as nations get stronger from trying so hard to get past the border, you may be able to move it over, squeeze by it a bit, or carve out a route that simply takes you around it. Or perhaps you find a way to climb over it. Increasingly, I think that's the moment in time that we are in. The moment the sacrifices of generations before us have brought us to. A moment where we can go around, above, or pass through the obstacles the Crown poses. Now, please do not get me wrong. It is hard, it is painful, it takes tremendous amounts of work, but it can and is being done. In saying all of this, it is not in any way to say or let the Crown off the hook. The Crown still has to radically change its laws, policies, and practices to reflect the recognition and implementation of our title and rights, including treaty rights, so that it can be in proper relationship with our governments and respect our laws and jurisdiction. But what does that change look like? Now, I know that this may initially be or sound a bit confusing, but what is needed is for the Crown's laws to retreat. To say it another way, Crown laws must do far less, not more. To say it another way, the path of reconciliation and self-government is for Crown laws to recede from occupying the legal and jurisdictional space that is rightfully the domain of our Indigenous laws and governments. Canada was founded on a fiction that there were limited or no laws and legal institutions before the settlers arrived. And so our Constitution was implemented on a myth that all legal and jurisdictional space was taken up by Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution, with federal and provincial powers. And in reflecting that fiction and myth throughout Canada's history, and even to this day, Crown laws and institutions operate on the assumption that the only space of or for our laws and institutions is when Crown laws say that there is space. And that fundamentally is how the Crown continues to think today. That is, it is up to them to still give or grant us the space for the operation and enforcement of our laws. But that, to be blunt, as I think you probably know, is utterly wrong-headed. It is, simply stated, a colonial mindset where the Crown continues to oppress. To say it another way, the Crown has long acted as if the only way for our nations and governments to move forward was for them to let us become part of the boulder. Rather, I would say again, the Crown's role is to pull back, to recognize that the boulder has to move away or to be shrunken down. There are still federal laws and policies, certainly, that need to change for Canada to move out of the way, to facilitate the evolution of our system of cooperative federalism. There is no question we need political will from all orders of government and their courage to move forward in more supportive ways. It is about recognition. There is jurisdictional space for Indigenous governments, and that it is not just about recognizing under federal statute that First Nations laws are laws for certain purposes and can be enforced as such. The Crown, federal, provincial, and territorial, must be transforming statutes so as to get their own legal house in order. So again, it can be in proper legal and jurisdictional relationship with First Nations governments. Federally, this means a legal regime designed to respect the authority of First Nations governments, just as the federal government has a legal regime designed to respect the authority of provincial governments or even foreign governments. But when we framed the work of the Crown, that the Crown must do in this way, it brings into focus certainly the roles and responsibilities of our nations, of which you have been talking about today, to self-determine, to self-govern, to determine our institutions of governance, and to be clear on our laws and the policy objectives behind them, based on our values and our visions. We cannot just sit there and think that the Crown will just do it and set the path of self-government and of nation rebuilding by changing its laws, policies, and practices. Because the solution, the transformation that is needed, is not just fixing the Crown's system. The solution, as I know you know, rather is in the revitalizing and rebuilding of our own structures and practices, including the hard work of enacting our own laws and occupying the field. This is key. This is self-determination. This is self-government jurisdiction. And to be sure, in doing this work, there is a critical role for national institutions to provide support to our re-emerging governments. As many of you know, many of our governments are small and have limited resources. The policy support that comes from working together is incredibly powerful. Now, there is one point that I want to stress here. And you can already see, as I always do, that I place a central emphasis on self-government. This is because I firmly believe that what is often called economic reconciliation cannot truly and meaningfully happen without substantial progress in rebuilding our nations and governments. Reconciliation is about transforming our relationship, our broken relationship with the Crown. The heart of that relationship, its very foundation, as I have touched on already, is between our government's laws and jurisdiction and the Crown's. Unless and until that proper relationship exists and we are empowered and exercising control over our own lives, our peoples, and communities, there is no amount of federal transfers or land claim settlements or revenue sharing agreements that will properly address the legacy of colonization that holds our people down. More so, it is only by retaking control through our institutions that we regain control over all the levers of revenue and wealth our people need, from taxation onward and from whatever deals we might negotiate with the Crown. To say it bluntly, true economic reconciliation occurs in the context of the recognition of the inherent right of self-government and the establishment of proper relationships with Crown governments. There are no shortcuts. So, to finish my first observation, increasingly we see examples that when faced with nations marching forward, the Crown is realizing it has no choice but to get out of the way. We see this, for example, in recent developments in Haida Gwaii, where the recognition of title by agreement now leads to broad jurisdictional recognition of the Haida. And we know how the Haida got there. They kept marching and paddling forward in the courts, in negotiations, in governance rebuilding, and here we are. We also see it nationally on the incredibly important issue of children and families. Our survivors spoke up at great cost to themselves. Our leaders spoke up on the need to undo Crown intrusion into the lives of our children and our families. Our champions fought in every venue there was, and what we see is the Crown clearing the path, moving the boulder aside. And the Supreme Court of Canada saying that this is an example of the long overdue legislative reconciliation between Crown and Indigenous laws and legal orders, braided together by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I know that there are many, many more examples like this. So to my second observation, which stems directly from the first. We must normalize the shift from ad hoc and arbitrary approaches to change to principled and coherent approaches to change. Again, this observation, it's pretty basic, right? I know that you know this, but I emphasize it because while it is obvious, it remains hard. And as I have spoken about before, this shift from being arbitrary to principled was and is one of the hardest lessons for Crown governments to embrace. When I was in government, I thought all the stars were aligned for principled change, from moving to a legislative framework that upheld self-government, provided a self-determining path out of the Indian Act, shifted to relations, or all relations, being based on the recognition and implementation of title and rights, and investment in Indigenous institutions like the ones you are a part of, so that nations were supported in building their governance on their core lands and over their entire territories across a whole suite of jurisdictions and based on their own economic imperatives. This vision was publicly committed to on the floor of the House of Commons, and the groundwork was laid to do it. And then, as I know you all know, it didn't happen. All this lofty political rhetoric aside, at the end of the day, and any way you cut it, there are still those within the federal government, and particularly those at the very top, and this includes also some working in the civil service, that cannot help but think that these changes, or think of these changes as a loss of power and control. And they fear that many voting Canadians will also view them as such. To say it another way, out of selfishness and ignorance, the Crown is scared of moving the boulder. So they make us do all the heavy lifting, as I described earlier. So even in small actions, actions that should not be hard to take, like recognizing that First Nations can make and enforce their own laws and bylaws on their lands through their own institutions, they're not taken, let alone moving the boulder of aside to recognize title and rights. Or if they are taken, it takes massive struggle to get there. This is why, in all the roles that I have played, I have advocated for laying a principled foundation for what we do, for all. We need principles, shared principles to guide the path forward and keep us on track. When we do not have such principles, we do not know where we are going or why we are headed in the direction we are. And without clear commitment to guiding principles, the Crown typically will fall back to entrenched practices of distract, delay, and deny. And what that results in is actions that are less effective, incoherent, and sporadic. It makes it harder to build on the success that the leadership in this room has shown. So in spite of some of the significant breakthroughs that have happened, such as the sectoral governance initiatives that you're all involved in, we still do not have a principled foundation for scaling rights recognition and achieving true reconciliation in Canada. Yes, while I was MOJAG and in government, we did start the process on title and rights issues with 10 principles, which were to be the foundation for a coherent approach to change laws, policies, and practices based on the recognition and implementation of rights. But given that that has not been followed through, we have been left with incomplete and ad hoc shifts that do not move the boulder, yet because of the shifts are incoherent and incomplete and unstable. So to give just one example, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples legislation federally says that UNDRIP applies to the laws of Canada and that the laws of BC apply in BC legislation. Well, Articles 3, 4, and 5 of UNDRIP affirm Indigenous self-determination, the inherent right of self-government, and the right of Indigenous peoples to maintain and finance their own governing structures. So that applies to the laws of Canada and BC, yet at the same time, the Indian Act is in place that imposes a model of band council governance on First Nations. And there still is no efficient mechanism to recognize an Indigenous group as self-governing and out of the Indian Act. At the same time in BC, there exists no legislative space for our provincial law to recognize a First Nations government unless it is a band council under the Indian Act, a not-for-profit society under a provincial statute, or is one of the few modern treaties, or has a special piece of legislation like the Federal Act recognizing the Haida Nation and the Council of the Haida Nation that received royal assent earlier this month. So yes, while such laws as UNDA are an important step forward and they have value, they are not actually making all the changes in laws, policies, and practices that are needed in a principled way for example, to support your nation to pursue its economic priorities, including through forms of revenue that you will raise, the laws that you will put in place to support your economic agendas, the fiscal capacity you build to care for your citizens, and the ways in which you will make decisions across your territories, and not just on your lands that are recognized as reserves under the Indian Act. So, collectively, as we move forward to implement an agenda based on rights recognition, it is important to advance and align with this foundational change in laws, policies, and practices, so that when you advance, for example, progress being made on building your economies and institutions, ensure it is also aligned with driving forward broader, coherent, and more principled approach to the overarching changes that are needed, so that legislative change is not always needed in an ad hoc way each time a First Nation or a group of First Nations take the next step in building and rebuilding their governing systems, so that Canada can get out of the way in a principled and simplified manner, so Canada can stop playing gatekeeper, so that when our nations are ready, the Crown is ready also. So this brings me to my third and last observation, which is we must break down the silos that colonialism has built up, learn from lived experience, and lead as in-betweeners. And that you, because of the rebuilding work that you're already engaged in and have done, are uniquely positioned to do that, especially with the change and the shift in the federal government that I suspect we all think is coming. I've spoken and written about a lot in recent years the invisible and visible silos that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, silos that have been built up as a result of colonialism. the divisions, the silos. They impact each and every one of us every day. Even as we live next door to each other, amongst each other, there are silos between us that we know so little, really, about each other's experiences, and how the reality of the silos is something that affects us all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and it is destructive. In Reconciling History, I write about siloed stories, historically and today, about who we are as a people or peoples, who we are as a nation or nations. For example, the predominant way Canada tells the story of the founding of Canada, the so-called fathers of Confederation, Upper and Lower Canada, and the story of Canada finding us, a not-so-pleasant story that Indigenous peoples tell that has its roots in the fact that when Canada was created, we were left out, not welcomed, a siloed story. In our communities every day, we have siloed stories that reflect siloed experiences, and we should not underestimate how siloed we are and how much work we still have to do. Siloed stories reinforce silos in society, separating and dividing people because we fail to understand each other's experiences, how we came to be where we are at, what responsibilities we bear for doing better, but also the positive and constructive things we do share. Silos contributed to us operating and making decisions based on false assumptions rather than a real understanding of each other. If we're going to live side by side together, and certainly none of us is going anywhere, then understanding our different ways of being is important. The reverse of assimilation, colonialism, and racism. It is knowledge, inclusion, and equity. Our collective challenge, if we want to advance true reconciliation and transform for the better how governing and economic growth occurs in this country, is to break down these silos to be able to tell a shared story of Canada, one that is based not on the experiences of the few, but of the many, including Indigenous peoples. And we need to translate this learning and understanding of each other into tangible changes in how we govern, organize, and act. This is what our reconciliation relies on. And in my view, with respect to economic reconciliation, it is not about redistributing how the economic pie is divided. It is about changing the ingredients and methods we use to bake the pie in the first place. Or, to say it another way, economic reconciliation is not about Indigenous peoples saying, "Give us our share." It is about recognizing that Indigenous peoples must be full and rightful parts of how decisions that shape our economy into the future are made, including with the proper role of our worldviews, priorities, and laws. And that when this occurs, we are all better off, with new opportunities for innovation and growth, with an economic pie that is revitalized and expanded, and with ignorant fears that economic reconciliation is a zero-sum game of redistribution rightfully set aside. And look, if indeed the shift that is anticipated politically comes to pass in the federal government, I think this will inevitably result in a more primary focus on economic reconciliation. This means in the period of rights recognition, we need to be prepared. We need to have a clear definition of what we mean by economic reconciliation, of what laws, policies, and practices need to change for it to advance, of how it will work on the ground in tangible and practical ways, and bring forward examples that demonstrate, as we know to be the case, that it is part of the path to building a stronger future for all Canadians. So as leaders, as nations, as First Nations leading the way in rebuilding, as fiscal institutions and a lab, I praise you and encourage you to continue to think about what you do and how you do it through the lens of breaking down silos and working together. Find ways to tell stories of your community that break down the silos, stories that are honest and inclusive, stories that see interconnection and intersection even when painful, that celebrate success and challenges failure, that upholds everyone while recognizing the distinctiveness of experience and reality. This is the basis for envisioning a community and economies where the silos are at first made more visible and then, over time, transformed. If we want to be leaders in the work of reconciliation and in the transformation of the status quo, we need to be in-betweeners, individuals and organizations that learn to walk between, translate between, and transcend the silos. It is not easy. It takes courage. It demands being uncomfortable, and it often means breaking away from and out of expectations. Now, I've seen some really great at it, but not nearly enough. And the role of an in-betweener is not often appreciated. As I've written and spoken about, the experiences and knowledge I had in Indigenous politics were not always valued or even able to be heard around the cabinet table. Just as in many Indigenous communities, we sometimes struggle to hear from and understand and learn from the experiences of those from the outside. And to be clear, the role of in-betweeners are not just Indigenous peoples. We all need to be, can learn to be, can choose to be, and act to be. Equally, some of the greatest contributors to the work of reconciliation are non-Indigenous peoples who have listened, learned, gained trust, and developed skills to work between Indigenous and non-Indigenous realities in bold and constructive and unique ways. We need far more. For those of you here today, we need you. My goodness, Canada needs you. And think about it in relationship to economic reconciliation. Think about how much faster change may drive forward if, as leaders on all sides, we increasingly played our roles in that way, always bridging the silos of the past. Think about how the work of transforming the economy itself is the work of breaking down silos between traditions, systems, and experiences, of how your work in rebuilding and with support of the institutions is in and of itself an act of in-betweeners. I want to congratulate you on all the incredibly important work that you do right across the country in terms of transforming your nations, supporting each other. I can't wait to come back 7 years from now to First Nations leading the way, and I guarantee at that time there will be all of our nations across the country engaged in some form of governance, reform, and rebuilding. Gaila Kusla, for all you do, you are truly leading the way.